Welcome to each and all of you, lovers of literature and students of architecture and history. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein Spielvogel, Chair of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center. The center is a group of dedicated individuals committed to informing the public about the past, present, and future of historic preservation in our city. We're here today to commemorate the life and work of the celebrated, distinguished writer, Philip Roth. Our warmest thanks to all our collaborators in this endeavor, to Judith Thurman and Julia Gollier for their involvement, to Lee Weiskopf, Jeff Heidings, and all the residents, the board, and building management of the Austin, and to all of you for joining us here today. A reminder that this event is being videotaped and will be available to the public via YouTube as part of the Diamonstein Spielvogel Video Archive housed at the David Rubenstein Library at Duke University. And it does get a lot of viewers. In fact, it's their most popular site, and this can only enhance it. We received a rush of responses this past week and want to send our regrets to anyone who, due to the limited space and lack of seating, was unable to join us today. We hope they'll take the opportunity to view the finished product, the tape, on YouTube when it goes up, I guess within a month. Since 1995, the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center has installed 118 cultural medallions. If that does not sound like a lot to you, ask the people involved in one of the most joyous processes of all the cultural medallions, how many steps and how elaborate it is. Please shake your head in assent. Throughout all the 5 boroughs. They commemorate artists, writers, politicians, choreographers, scientists, musicians, social justice warriors, and entrepreneurs, each of whom have made a substantial cultural, economic, or social or political contribution to our city. The cultural medallion was designed by the celebrated graphic artist Massimo Vignelli, and like all of the things he has done for us, museum exhibitions, the street signs in every single historic district, including many in the very active West Side, are all designed pro bono by Massimo Vignelli. They help bring history alive by reminding us that it is what happened inside these buildings, what the people who lived here accomplished, that matters. Each cultural medallion, honors the past and gives us hope for the future. These brief biographies remind us that it is people from all walks of life who have made this city what it is today. And now a warm welcome to our speakers. I will tell you who each of them are, and then we will ask Joel Canaro to be the master of ceremonies after I tell you about each of them. Judith Thurman is the author of Isaac Dinesen, The Life of a Storyteller, winner of the National Book Award for Biography, of which the Oscar-winning film Out of Africa was based. She's contributed to The New Yorker since 1987, and as a staff writer since 2000. She's the recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Harold Vercel Memorial Award for prose style and a Chevalier of the Order of Arts and Letters of the French Republic. Dr. Julia Gollier, the too modest Julia Gollier, is a longtime friend and co-executor of the Philip Roth Literary Estate. Writer and journalist Claudia Roth-Pierpont has contributed to The New Yorker since 1990, becoming a staff writer in 2004. Her lively and clever remarks, I would say that, but Martin Amis said it first in the New York Times, about her 2013 biography, Roth Unbound, a writer in his books, has been translated into several languages. She has a doctorate in Italian Renaissance art history and is a recipient of a Whiting Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a fellowship at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. Mary Carr, an award-winning poet and best-selling memoirist, is the author of the critically acclaimed and New York Times best-selling memoir, The Liars Club, Cherry and Lit, as well as The Art of Memoir, and 5 poetry collections. Most recently, Tropic of Squalor. She's also a songwriter, an NEA, a Radcliffe Bunting Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellow, a regular contributor to The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Poetry magazine. The noted critic, Charles McGrath, is the former editor of the New York Times Book Review, former deputy editor at The New Yorker, and happily continues to write for both publications. He is the editor of the recent Library of America collection of John O'Hara stories, currently at work on a similar edition of Donald Barthelme's work. Dr. Joel Canaro, where are you, Joel? In his proper attire, he'll explain it to you, who will serve as Master of Ceremonies, has written extensively about American poets, now the President Emeritus of the Guggenheim Foundation. He was Dean at Penn, where he and Philip Roth were English department colleagues, a long, long-term friendship. He has served as director of the Modern Language Association and editor of its journal, PMLA, and where I first met him as president of PEN America and the National Book Foundation. Thank you to everyone who participated in this important program and all those who made it possible. And thanks to you, audience. And if you know of an individual who's made a significant contribution in a building that still exists and is verifiable, we'd like to know about it. And now, we will turn to our program. But there is something that I wanted to point out, that throughout literature and many other areas of life, many appropriations have taken place, as most of you know. And I know of someone whose name was appropriated. For those of you who are familiar, I assume all of you, with Portnoy's complaint, the very last line, after a 257 or so page litany, the very last line in the book is ascribed to Dr. Spielvogel. There is a Dr. Spielvogel who planned on being here today, and he wanted to say, as he did in the novel, "And now let us begin." Beautiful. Joel.
So great.
Barbara Lee, it's wonderful to join forces with you again. As she told you, we served together when I was at Penn, and I salute you for this wonderful job that you've done in seeing that buildings are appropriately honored. Either way, Grace Paley lived in my building, so I'll tell you.
Don't tell me, write it to us.
Okay. Well, it's wonderful here to be with so many of Philip's nearest and dearest. As Barbara Lee said, Philip and I were English teachers at the University of Pennsylvania, and we were in our 30s. Students would start lining up at 4:30 in the morning to get into his class, and at the end of the day, he and I would have dinner in one of Philadelphia's fabled restaurants, LOL, and then he would get on the train back for New York. And this was the beginning of a marvelous friendship. You know, Barbara Lee introduced me as Joel, but that's not what I'm known by in this building. Every time I entered the lobby, the agreeable man who sat behind the counter here would say, get on the phone with Philip Roth. Mr. Roth, Derek Jeter is here. And I hear the laughter, so some of you know who Derek Jeter was. Some of you may not. He was the Yankees' peerless shortstop. And Philip and I had many an agreeable afternoon and evening watching the Yankees. So I'm glad to see all of you here, and I will return to say some things a bit later, right? Okay, and now we will hear from Judith Thurman. Judith.
I had forgotten about the wonderful Dr. Spielvogel in the last line. It's perfect. Since Philip died, I've written and delivered about half a dozen eulogies at memorials around the world, actually. And I wanted to speak here in a rather more personal way, unscripted way, a conversational way, because this was actually a place of so much intimate conversation for the friends of Philip's who were here. And yet, Philip would laugh. I'm holding a speech that I wrote, typed, and printed. And he liked to tease me. He would say, "You don't have a spontaneous bone in your body." That's fairly true, except in one respect, which is the spontaneity of the grief that I feel every time I think about him, think about his not being here, and that I'll never hear his laugh again. And that the spontaneity of the feelings about his absence just come from a place that is unscripted. This memorial is especially meaningful for me because I spent so much time here. I think all of us, the friends here, did. There was a wonderful view over the brownstones on 78th Street as far as the towers in Midtown, and the pigeons would perch on the terrace. I think that Philip would have been really delighted, tickled. I was trying to find the right word, tickled, by his new status as a New York landmark. For it really is his status as a landmark that we're celebrating. And that's appropriate because he lived here and worked here, read and slept, he played and suffered. He did a lot of suffering here. It was his last home. And he was himself here. He was Roth Unbound. He did some seduction here, as one has read, several places. It was the site of certain poignant reunions because in his last years he met up again with people he had lost track of, old girlfriends, college friends, neighbors from Newark, relatives, remote relatives who would remind him of things in his life, and that was extremely precious to him. And it was a place also where he patched up some old quarrels, where he reconciled with people he, for one reason or another, had been furious with, and he usually couldn't remember the reason by the time he ran into them again and said, "Come for lunch." So this scrupulous stylist was very particular about his decor. He went to great lengths to have a luxurious bathtub installed in a kind of closet-like enclave in the apartment. It was sort of like one of those water closets in a French chateau. And when the door was open, you could see the view. But I don't think he ever took a bath there. The decor was otherwise practical and austere and manly and rigorously edited because he chose his possessions with care and he chose them to last. And while he was a child of the Depression, he was very frugal in most respects. For example, like many New Yorkers of his generation and of my generation too, we don't like taking taxis that are going in the wrong direction. But Philip once, he was not well, and he sent me to the linen shop around the corner to get him some new sheets. And he told me what he wanted, and I called him from the shop. I said, "The king duvet in 1,000 thread Egyptian cotton costs $1,000. And he reminded me of a line that he had loved in my biography of Dennison, which she said was her favorite phrase because it was the most erotic phrase in the English language, which was, "regardless of expense." Philip dined out quite a bit around in the neighborhood at Barney Greengrass, where I just had the pleasure of lunch with his old friend from Paris, Anafi Kokrat. He dined at Patsy's, the venerable old red sauce Italian place, and why he loved it we still have not figured out. He went to Shun Li, a little to the south, where he liked to point out the place was always mobbed with Jews on Rosh Hashanah. And he said, it seems to be as much a part of the holiday as blowing the shofar. He sometimes ventured across town to my neighborhood where we ate at the restaurant he was pleased to call the Ganef's Table. The Ganef being Eli Zabar, who had the chutzpah, Philip said, to charge $7 for a tomato. But mostly Philip liked to eat at home here, and especially once he discovered the luxury of and embraced the luxury of a private chef. And I was very happy to have found two of those wonderful young people for him, Oliver and Camille, and they succeeded his beloved Catherine. And as Joel said, after dinner, there was a routine. You'd put an old movie on, you would watch a game of baseball. If it was an election, God forbid, you'd watch the returns. And sometimes Rachel Maddow, though by the time she signed off, it was bedtime. Once Claudia and I met on the street outside the building on our way to one of those dinners, and Philip usually only had 2 people at a time. We noticed that the street was closed, that a crowd had gathered on the peak of the hill, which is just right about in front of the front door. And it was we discovered the evening of Manhattanhenge, when the sun setting in the west over the river and the moon rising in the east over the museum are precisely aligned, and their glowing orbs mirror each other. Philip was too ill to come downstairs, but it was an event that he was present in his own way because he loved opposition, he loved the elemental and the forces of nature, and in his own way he was one. I wrote too much of this. Does anyone know how long I've been talking? Okay. I've often, this of course wasn't Philip City, which was Newark, but if medallions on buildings honor native sons and daughters, but they often also honor emigres, refugees, vagabonds, escapees, and provincials. And Philip liked to chide me when I dwelled too much upon the fact that I was one of those provincials. He would say, stop going on about fucking Queens. We all come from somewhere else. He was very vigilant about grandiosity, including his own. And you could always count on him to bring you down to earth as a person and as a writer. And he counted on you to bring his sentences down to earth if you were one of his readers. And so there's something to me very poetic about the act of affixing a piece of metal to a brick wall because it celebrates Philip's struggle to nail it. Now, the medallion does in some ways make this edifice into a shrine. And shrines are a temptation that Philip would have scoffed at because veneration was alien to him and disbelief was always his point of departure. And I think he agreed with Nietzsche that work invents the man who has created it. Great men, as they are venerated, are subsequent pieces of wretched minor fiction. He might indeed have preferred to think of the medallion like the light on a taxi cab going in the right direction, something we can hail on a dark night. Now here I would like to say I'm deeply grateful to Barbara Lee, Diamondstein-Spielvogel. I call her Barbara Lee in a familiar way because she's a friend. Not only for making this possible, but for leaping with such relish and alacrity at the chance to do so, and then seeing it through so swiftly and with such care, taking Rothian pains with the text. And I also would like to recommend you, Barbara has a recent book called Notable New Yorkers, which is derived from her work with the Historic Landmarks Commission, and in which you can discover what other luminaries belong to this club. I think Philip would have liked the eclectic company. Richard Wright, Washington Irving, Bella Abzug, and Henry James. I'd like to get those two at a dinner party. The Gershwin brothers, Jonas Salk, and many others, but my own personal favorite now, apart from Philip, may be Alfred Butts, who invented Scrabble. And there are many ways of putting words together. Thank you.
Well, I'm just reminded, seeing Judith, that one of the wonderful things about Philip was that he had a habit over the years of writing letters to complete strangers whose work he admired. Imagine what it must be like to be a young writer, or even a not-so-young writer, to get a fan letter from Philip Roth. And many of these those who received his epistolary beneficence became part of his charm circle. And I think of Jack Miles and Judith Thurman.
Roth had stopped writing when we met, so at an event dedicated to his literary legacy, I'd like to praise him solely as a friend. He'd hate that, Ben Taylor told me. It's been also mentioned that Roth would have scripted all our eulogies and put his hand in the back of our heads like sock puppets. Lust had been Roth's life force and his slave master, and at our first dinner, he quipped to me, "Just so you know, you're too old for me." I was 60, he was 80-something. I said, "I haven't thrown any pussy at you, don't flatter yourself." When he roared, I knew we had decided to say anything to each other so long as it was true. As a radical feminist since about age 12, I at first wondered about aspects of the great man's reputation. It's true that his subject was partly desire, and the more transgressive, the better. But American literature needed him to open those territories, and it's impossible to judge that work by today's yardsticks, when it was fashioned to fight against the Victorianism of what Robert Lowell called the anesthetized 50s. It's the artist's job, Chekhov said, not to solve a moral problem, but to represent it accurately, not to indict the horse thief, but to render the soul of one. It's also true that I often argued with him about sexual politics, as I do with pretty much any man born before 1980. But to read Dara Horn accuse him of misogyny by quoting Alexander Portnoy as though she were quoting Roth himself and not a character Roth found ludicrous, that kind of thing distressed me no end. It was his death that vindicated him to me, I think. For in the last week before he died, as Judith noted, so many women, friends and ex-lovers, were at his bedside. And each one was more accomplished than the last. There was not a bimbo in the bunch. Julia Grolier, who became his executor and who's a psychiatrist when she's not doing things like this. Actress Mia Farrow, a theologian, a biographer, a woman who ran a thoroughbred horse farm down south. He'd maintained friendships with these women that were decades long. I assure you that when I die, any lovers who show up at my bedside will be holding pillows to place over my face. He talked to me like nobody ever had. In my native state of Texas, we would have said he was a doodle, which means he was antic and he broke rules. He talked to me, in fact, like he was hunting for an Easter egg, like I had some secret that he needed to know about. And nobody I ever met made me feel more seen and wondered about, and ultimately cared for. He saw me as some American Aborigine, and he called me Huck, like Huck Finn. He's who I called when my plane landed. "Hey, Huck," he'd say, and I'd say, "Hey, Roth, I landed, I'm not dead." I went on saying that till he was. And so I stand here talking into that massive silence he left behind, humming through all our bodies today now like a dial tone.
Thank you, Julia Golier, Dr. Golier.
I say, this is a tough crowd to follow, but I'll do my best. Thank you. First, I want to thank Barbara Lee, Diamondstein Spielvogel, and the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center on behalf of the estate for granting this cultural medallion in honor of the life and work of Philip Roth. Philip, no doubt, would be deeply honored. It is fitting that the medallion will be placed here at the Austin, which is where his studio was from 1988 until his death. It was combined with another apartment in 2004 to create a space he could also live in. He called it his writing factory. The factory had 2 bedrooms, one on each end, connected by a long living room. This central area was kept barely furnished, so Philip could maintain what he called a raceway, used for pacing and thinking while he worked. Though somewhat basic, the area contained all the essential elements. an Eames chair and ottoman for reading, a stand-up writing desk, a word processor that never got updated beyond WordPerfect 5.1, and a single couch for visitors. As Judith mentioned, uniquely there was a room-sized bathtub with pocket doors directly off the living room, used for soaking his bad back after a day at the factory. His years here were made better by the beloved doormen with whom he chatted on his way in and out of the building about the Yankees, girls, and the weather. You could hear a little of Herman Roth in him in these exchanges. "How's your ticker?" he would ask Kenny, with whom he shared several ailments. A simple note to the super, Pedro Arroyo, was found among his papers. "I want to thank you for all you've done to make my life easy and happy for me at 130 West 79th Street." That's Pedro right there for people who don't know. And Kenny, where's Kenny? Is Kenny here? Where's Kenny? And that's Kenny. He was I swear Kenny was the first person I thought of when Philip died. I thought, what is Kenny going to do? Poor Kenny. The goal of the Cultural Medallion program is to keep the history of New York City alive through recognition of some of its remarkable residents. They have an interactive map on their website, which is HLPCculturalmedallions.org, where you can see all the elegant medallions throughout the 5 boroughs. Though I must mention that they're a little scant in Staten Island. One after another, you see the names of noteworthy people with whom Philip would have happily associated or had already imagined into his work. He would have been the author of the great American novel would have been thrilled to be in the company of not one, but 2 great baseball players, the Sultan of Swat, Babe Ruth, and Jackie Robinson. One of Philip's happiest childhood memories, we learned on his 80th birthday, was seeing Jackie Robinson play against the Newark Bears at Rupert Stadium, quote, in 1946, the year before he broke into the lily white leagues with the Brooklyn Dodgers as baseball's first black player. He also would have been charmed to be in the company of Fats Waller, whose medallion is way out in Queens. He loved to entertain friends singing "Your Feet's Too Big." He often said that song should open his memorial, and Jeff Pasternak and I, in fact, snuck it in there discreetly. He would be glad to be paired again with George Gershwin, whose plaque is on Riverside Drive. The 2 of them were awarded prizes by the Pulitzer Board in 1998. Gershwin posthumously for his distinguished contributions to American music, and Philip for the masterpiece American Pastoral. Ironically, the critic Michiko Kakutani, who also got incorporated into his work, received a Pulitzer Prize that year, though she is still very much alive. He would be excited to be reunited with his historical characters. There is a plaque in the Bronx honoring New York City Mayor Fiorillo Henry LaGuardia, who appears as his fictionalized self in The Plot Against America, and one in Midtown honoring Dorothy Thompson, the intrepid girl reporter who fought Nazism in the same book. He would also be flattered to be commemorated along with Jonas Salk, whose vaccine wiped out the virus that brought down the playground director, Bucky Cantor, in his final book, Nemesis. But I was most excited when I found the medallion at 1200 Fifth Avenue for Marian Anderson, because she is referenced in the book with Spielvogel that, for better or worse, made Philip truly famous. You may recall that Sunday when the 12-year-old Alexander Portnoy takes the number 14 bus to downtown Newark, headed to the Empire Burlesque House to get a look. The closer he gets, the more fearful he becomes of being contaminated or getting caught. Quote, "What if I get killed? Or even worse, arrested? What about my picture in the Newark Evening News when the cops throw on the lights and cry, 'Okay, freaks, this is a raid'? What if the flash bulbs go off and get me, already president of the International Relations Club in my 2nd year of high school? Me, who skipped 2 years of grammar school. Why, in 1946, because they wouldn't let Marian Anderson sing in Convention Hall, I led my entire 8th grade class in refusing to participate in the annual patriotic essay contest sponsored by the DAR." End quote. You learn from reading the Medallion that even though she was prevented from performing at Convention Hall, Marian Anderson was the first African American to perform at the White House. Fittingly, the author of Portnoy's Complaint would go on to receive a national medal from the first African American to occupy the White House. In Philip's beautiful late life meditation on death, Sabbath Theater, there is a scene where Mickey goes to a cemetery at the Jersey Shore in search of his family and wonders what will happen to him when he dies. Quote, "Getting to the old graves, to the burial ground established in the early days by the original seashore Jews, he gave the funeral in procession a wide berth and was careful to steer clear of the watchdogs when he passed the little prayer house. These dogs had not yet been made conversant with the common courtesies, let alone the ancient taboos that obtain in a Jewish cemetery. Jews guarded by dogs? Historically very, very wrong. His alternative was to be buried bucolically on Battle Mountain, as close to his late mistress Drenka as he could get. This had occurred to him long before today. But whom would he talk to up there? He had never found a goy yet who could talk fast enough for him. And there, they'd be slower than usual. He would have to swallow the insult of the dogs. No cemetery is going to be perfect. For himself, Philip found a near-perfect cemetery. It is at Bard College along the Hudson. But I do wonder if he has enough people to talk to up there. Being joined together through geography, history, and imagination with these other Medallion recipients, some of whom could talk fast enough for him, is perhaps the best kind of afterlife Philip could have imagined.
Listening to Julia, I was reminded of the time that Philip and I went up to Dartmouth, where he was receiving an honorary degree. And he was sitting on the platform with Jesse Norman. And Jim Friedman, the president, said, "We're now going to sing the Dartmouth fight song." And Jesse turned to Philip and said, "But I don't know the words." And Philip said, "Oh, that's okay, just follow me." And of course, we lost Jesse Norman this year. And we also lost one of Philip's most ardent admirers, the great Harold Bloom, who was on record as saying that it's perfectly clear that Philip Roth was our greatest novelist since Faulkner.
Thank you, Claudia Pierpont.
Given the professional tendencies of this neighborhood, Philip liked to call 79th Street Writer's Block. And now that this plaque is here, I suppose it's official, and many more people will be able to share the joke. It is a very strange thing, though, to see a friend's house, a spot where you waited for him to come down to get a taxi, become a kind of a monument. But that's the nature of New York, the nature of the constantly changing history of these streets that he loved. When he got back from living in London in the 80s, he would stand on the street corners and just smile and say, "I'm home." Home, where unlike in England, he could understand the inner life of the language and he could use the language. British English, he said, was as useless to him as a writer as Latvian. This was maybe the only neighborhood, I can't be sure, but it seems that way, where he was constantly recognized and stopped and asked what he thought about things as though he were already a good friend or a part of the family. I once saw a woman on these streets hand him her cell phone. She had her husband on the line, and she handed him the phone because she said he was her husband's favorite writer, and would he mind talking to him? Philip thought it was very funny, and he took the call. When I first moved to 79th Street, I'm one of the writers on Writer's Block. I live a few doors down. There wasn't even an apartment building on this site. It was, strangely enough, a synagogue, a quite magnificent Byzantine-style synagogue, built in the 1920s and torn down only in 1983. My husband, who is an architect and a snapper-up of architectural treasures, managed to haul away a couple of joining pieces of marble with a fraction of a Hebrew inscription on them. And although they've been in our living room for years, I only recently asked an Israeli friend to read the word or words on them for me. I felt a bit of a start when she said that there was just one full word on both plaques: truth. There was no truer writer to the human mind and heart, to the way we speak and the way we live, than Philip Roth. The closest he had to a literary credo is something that he had Nathan Zuckerman lift from Kafka. I quote, "I believe that we should read only those books that bite and sting us," Nathan says. "If a book we are reading does not rouse us with a blow to the head, then why read it?" I would like to read just a couple of paragraphs from one of the many books Philip wrote that bite and sting us. Books that, to continue to completion, Kafka's quote, books that work like an axe for the frozen sea within us. I'd like to read just a tiny bit from Patrimony, which is a work of nonfiction, when Philip is listening to his 86-year-old father, who is dying of a brain tumor, talk over his options with his surgeon, Dr. Benjamin. My father's unembellished style and the fight that was obviously still in him despite his age and all he was up against seemed somewhat to beguile the sophisticated neurosurgeon and even to touch some chord of personal sympathy. Several times in recounting the history of his illness, my father had veered off into an anecdote out of his Newark childhood some 75 years earlier. A narrative whose subterranean message appeared to be that he had learned to be realistic on Rutgers Street and was prepared for whatever befell him now. He and life went way back together, and he wanted Benjamin to know that too. To each story, whether about standing up to the Irish ruffians from Down Neck in Newark or working after school in his cousin's blacksmith shop, the doctor listened with nearly as much curiosity as impatience, and he kindly waited to steer him back to the business at hand until my father had illustrated his point. Then he explained to him in detail how the needle would be inserted up through the roof of the mouth, the tissue removed from the tumor with a needle, and so on, step by step. "And radiation?" my father asked again, a little desperately this time. Quote, "The biopsy will determine if it is the kind of tumor that responds to radiation." This is the surgeon speaking. "There is always a chance that given the size of your tumor and the length of time you've probably had it, not a great one." "Understand," my father said. "I'm talking about just another 3 or 4 years. The doctor nodded. He understood very well. The original question, for a couple more years, had in a matter of minutes been extended to 3 or 4, I noticed. My father was obviously coming to trust and even to imbue with a certain divine might this doctor, who was at once so much more patrician and potent-looking than Hamisher, heavy-set Dr. Meyerson, who had proposed to do rather more than stick a needle up through the roof of his mouth. It occurred to me that if we were all to sit and talk together in Benjamin's office for another day or two, my father would eventually overcome his fear of calling down even worse misery upon himself by appearing sinfully greedy, and proclaim to this doctor what had to be in his heart, which was that he wanted not just 3 or 4 years more, but to tackle the whole damn thing all over again. And now Roth's father speaks. "I raised myself up out of the immigrant streets without even a high school education. I never knuckled under, never broke the law, never lost my courage or said, 'I quit.' I was a faithful husband, a loyal American, a proud Jew. I gave 2 wonderful boys every opportunity I myself never had, and what I am demanding is only what I deserve. Another 86 years. Why, he would ask him, should a man die at all? And of course, he would have been right to ask. It's a good question."
Thank you, Mr. McGrath.
I'm afraid that a lot of what I have to say has already been said.
We'll say it again.
I'm going to say it again, and it proves what a singular impression Philip left on all of us. We think of Philip Roth as the great writer of New Jersey, and he was, of course. And New York doesn't figure all that much in his books, and often when it does, it's ironically. In Exit Ghosts, for example, Nathan Zuckerman, Roth's great alter ego, has been living for years in near seclusion in the country, but decides to give New York another chance. Placing an ad in the New York Review of Books, he arranges to swap his rural retreat for a 3-room apartment on West 71st Street, not far from where we are right now. He wants to resume residence re-embodied, he says, and take on all the things I decided to relinquish. He lasts exactly a week before fleeing back to his farmhouse. And that's the last we hear of him, not just in this book, but forever. Exit Zuckerman. Roth, on the other hand, never abandoned the city, except one time briefly when he moved to Woodstock because the backlash from Portnoy was too great. For most of his career, he divided his time between this very apartment building and his place in Connecticut. But for much of that time, Connecticut was a place of almost monastic isolation, where he lived alone most of the time and did little but write. He was so solitary there, he told me once, that he sometimes found himself in the evening talking to the woodchucks. You could say, really, that Connecticut was where he went to work, but New York was where he went to live. All the things that Zuckerman hates on his short-lived visit to the city. The crowds at Lincoln Center that I did not want to join, the theater complexes whose movies I had no inclination to see, the leather goods shops and gourmet food shops whose merchandise I didn't care to buy. All those things are things that Roth loved. He loved going to concerts. He loved eating at Barney Greengrass. He loved just strolling the streets and listening to New Yorkers talk. New York talk, in fact, was crucial to his development as a writer. In an interview in 2005, he said that moving back to New York in 1962 was a turning point for him. He'd been living in Chicago then, working on what he called his apprenticeship, letting go and when she was good. Not too shabby for apprentice work. But one was a Henry James knockoff and the other an attempt at a Midwestern Dreiser-like novel. He told me that he discovered the writer he wanted to be at dinner parties right here on the Upper West Side. I was back in touch with my place, Roth said. Getting back to New York, I had friends who were metropolitan Jews, whose conversation was very different from what it was back in the Middle West. His friends in those days included Robert Brustein, who was then teaching drama at Columbia, the writer Albert Goldman, the editors Jason and Barbara Epstein, and the cartoonist Jules Pfeiffer. And their get-togethers sound electric, with each of them trying to outdo the other and get the most laughs. Roth said they enabled him to unshackle himself from certain rules of literary conduct. I was encouraged by the wildness of our conversation and by the comic rivalry, he explained. There was no way I was going to be able to get that into the when she was good formula. I needed to find my freedom as a writer, to get in touch with my real verbal talent. I think it's fair to say that it was here in New York that Philip Roth learned to sound like Philip Roth, and he was forever grateful. He was very pleased in 2005 when the city of Newark put a plaque on his boyhood home there, and I'm sure he'd feel the same way about this medallion. I know he'd joke about it. He'd probably compare himself to a taxi cab, but he'd be enormously gratified.
Well, there are a couple of things that have come to mind as I've listened to our eloquent friends. One, reading from Patrimony, reminded me that after the age of 60, Philip did something that's unprecedented in American letters, even by Henry James. He wrote book after book, glorious books, not any of them like the other, which won major prizes. The National Book Critics Circle, for example, if you can imagine 24 critics sitting around a table at the Algonquin for Patrimony, the Penn Faulkner Prize for Operation Shylock, and, is that okay? The National Book Award for one of Philip's own favorites, Sabbath Theater. Philip was indisposed, so I went to the dinner, and the woman sitting next to me said, there isn't a chance in hell that Sabbath Theater is going to win. So I had a nice little moment to gloat when I went up on the platform to receive it. And then, of course, American Pastoral. The way the Pulitzer jury works is this. There are 3 people on the jury who are asked to nominate 3 books in alphabetical order without indicating any preference, and the final decision is made by the board, mostly newspapermen. And the year that American Pastoral was published, one of the best books in the 30 years, there was another great book, one of the best books of the 30 years, and that was Don DeLillo's Underworld. And my fellow juror is on the panel, Gail Caldwell, the great critic, and I said, wouldn't it be nice if for once the Pulitzer gave 2 prizes? I think that would have made Philip very happy. Now, I see all of you here, and I have one more thing to say, and that is with most canonical writers, if you mention a name, there's a Pavlovian response. Mention Fitzgerald, and you think Gatsby. Mention Steinbeck, you think The Grapes of Roth. Melville, Moby Dick. But that's not the case with Philip. I think if I were asked each of you to name 1 or 2 of your favorite books, I wouldn't at all be surprised if we had 20 or 30 titles floating around. And that's all as it should be. By the way, a couple of people have asked me about my jacket. This is a Weequig warm-up jacket. I wore it to Philip's 80th, but I found it in a thrift shop. He was vastly amused by the idea of the Weequig water jacket.
Explain.
Sorry?
Explain the significance. Explain the significance.
Well, Weequig was his school. Yeah, Weequig was. Well, I want to again thank Barbara Lee for arranging this marvelous event. I would like to recognize someone here, and that's Rosalind Schloss. I mentioned the 4 books that Philip wrote after 30. Rosalind Schloss is without any question the greatest copy editor in the history of the world. And I don't know where she is right now, probably hiding her face. There she is back there. Rosalind, you're the best. Wonderful to see you all. This is something that we'll all remember for a long time.
Thank you. And thanks to each and all of you, Doodles. And I think on behalf of this entire crowd, I dare say I can no other answer make, but thanks and thanks and ever thanks. It was memorable, it was worthy, and also worthy of publication. Thanks to all of you for coming. We will now go outside to dedicate this cultural medallion. I'm going to ask Judith Thurman and Dr. Julia Gollier to do not take the paper off till we're all out there, and to read the text. I have a copy for you. And we'll see you outside. Thank you all for coming.
It was wonderful.
Philip Roth, March 19, 1933, to May 22nd, 2018, the Austin, 130 West 79th Street, Manhattan. Philip Roth was among the greatest American writers of any generation. He published 31 books of fiction, memoir, and essays. More than half were worked on here, his studio, then his residence from 1988 until his death. He received numerous national and international awards, some several times, from the beginning to the end of his career. Among them, the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, the PEN/Faulkner Award, the Man Booker International Prize, and the National Humanities Medal. He was celebrated around the world. He, in turn, championed the work of others, voices of dissent from Eastern Europe, overlooked artists of his generation, dozens of younger writers. Roth's enduring masterworks include Goodbye Columbus, 1959, Portnoy's Complaint, 1969, The Ghostwriter, 1979, The Counterlife, 1986, Sabbath's Theater, 1995, American Pastoral, and Nemesis, 2010. Oh, sorry, I forgot a line. The Human Stain, 2000, The Plot Against America, 2004, and Nemesis, 2010. The writer was as fierce as the man was generous, an enemy of cant, and an advocate of freedom in
all its guises, personal and political. Thank you.
Bravo.